Hi there, and welcome to the show. I am your host, John Ivison. This week I'm joined by regular guests Eugene and Ian Brodie. Gents, welcome back.
Morning, John.
Good to be here.
In our capacity as armchair generals, I'd like to take a look at yesterday's cabinet swearing in and tell Mark Carney where he went wrong. Sir John A. Macdonald used to talk about cabinet making relying on the lumber with which the voters deliver to him. How do you think he did? Let's start, Ian. What do you think? What were your first impressions?
Well, there's some deep experience here on the very front bench, which I think is on the whole is promising. It does point out, though, the problem for Mr. Carney is so much continuity with the Trudeau government and with Mr. Trudeau's team. It is sort of look like a rearrangement of the chairs that he inherited around the cabinet table at that point. But also, of course, some good new talent, and I would have to say, for the most part, the more secondary positions, the sort of the second tier of people around the table. The one bit of continuity I would say here is Dominic LeBlanc on the Canada-U.S. trade and security front. Everybody else seems to have had that, if I understand correctly, the Canada-U.S. stuff carved out of their portfolio with a focus on LeBlanc, who, of course, has been managing this since the Mr. Trudeau's dinner at Mar-a-Lago back in December at New Year's. So we'll see if that gives Mr. LeBlanc a bit more running room on the Canada-U.S. files over the course of the next couple of months. Where we stand on that vis-a-vis other countries isn't exactly clear to me, but there'll be a strong continuity there. The rest of the group, I got to say, for the new people, downtown Toronto, kind of urban progressives, a strong focus on the kind of Rosedale, Forest Hill, Leaside corridor, a very central Canada focused, almost obsessively Toronto focused cabinet here. I think we'll see how that plays out over the next couple of months, and we'll see how many of those people really are going to be power players in Mr. Carney's government and who are sort of window dressing.
Well, let's come back to that in a minute. The Environment Minister comes from Toronto Danforth, which is hardly...
Jack Layton's riding.
Yeah, Jack Layton's riding.
Once,
exactly,
once,
but not in touch with the West, I would suggest, which is where a lot of the environment portfolio resides. Gene, what were your first impressions?
Well, John, you invoked our first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald. I'm going to invoke William Gladstone, British Prime Minister, who said a Prime Minister needs to be a butcher. It's a well-known phrase that he is often quoted as having said. A less well-known phrase is from a more obscure British politician who you will, I think both of you will know, Rab Butler, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, to Harold Macmillan, who once lamented the fact that he didn't become Prime Minister, in his view, because he didn't know where the joints were. He didn't know how to cut up the carcass. I think today Mr. Carney's looking more like Rab Butler than William Gladstone.
Mm-hmm. You want to expand on that?
Yeah. There are far too many, in my view, Trudeau-era ministers in this cabinet. I count 11 out of 28. About 40% of this cabinet are former Trudeau-era ministers. There is no reason for that. Mr. Carney owes none of these people anything. And he had an opportunity here to really show change in this cabinet, and he chose not to. Now, many will say, well, that's just about the optics. You know, he's trying to convince people it's a different government, and maybe he should have changed out more ministers to have a stronger case there. It's more than about optics. It's about competence. Many of us, I think, maybe all of us on this today would say that one of the Trudeau government's, the last Trudeau government's great failings was its relative lack of competence in governing. I don't know how you improve the competence in your governing when 40% of your ministers are from a government that was less than competent. Now, having said that, I will say one positive thing. I think this cabinet does look and feel to me a little more business friendly and a little more focused on the economy, particularly with the appointment of Mr. Hodgson. But I also think the keeping champagne in finance is probably not a bad thing from the business community perspective. He is, I think, generally well liked in the business community, and he actually talks to business, and he doesn't talk to business through his officials. He talks to business directly. I take Ian's point that there's a pretty central Canada heavy bias to this cabinet, but I'm at a loss to think of any recent Liberal cabinet that hasn't suffered from that basic challenge. So all in all, I think that Mr. Carney missed an opportunity here to really get out his butcher knife, which I think was needed. And he really didn't need to keep any more than 4 or 5 of Mr. Trudeau's top ministers. If they're looking for stability or continuity, that's often what you see. When Mr. Trudeau came in, I think he had 4 or 5 ministers that had been ministers in previous governments. Even when Mr. Chrétien came in 1993, I think he had maybe 5 Trudeau-era ministers, not including himself. There was no need to have this many Trudeau-era ministers in this cabinet.
I pretty much endorse everything you said there, Eugene. Ian, going back to what you just raised about the Central Canada issue and the downtown Toronto issue, you know, the Liberals did elect an MP in Calgary who did not make it into cabinet. I think there are 5 cabinet ministers west of the Ontario-Manitoba border. Does the appointment of Tim Hodgson compensate for that? I mean, he does seem to be more pro-energy than what's gone before him, but there does seem to be. I mean, when one of your biggest issues is national unity, and you've got a lot of downtown Toronto and Stephen Guilbeault as the Minister of Canadian Identity, which would seem to be red rag to a bull.
Well, let me say on the issue of Corey Hogan, I know Corey Hogan. Of course, we worked at the University of Calgary together until a few minutes ago, until he was brought in midway through the campaign to replace a failed Liberal candidate in Calgary Confederation. He's, I think, well known in the Calgary area. He's got strong communication skills, frankly, stronger communication skills than any of the other people I've seen appointed to this cabinet. So missing him from the cabinet ranks or from the Secretary of State ranks or however we're going to structure this thing, I think was a missed opportunity for outreach in the Calgary area. It's nice to have a minister from Edmonton. It's better to have somebody from Calgary if you're trying to get the growth potential of oil and gas unleashed, or even some of the other resources here. Yeah, Tim Hodgson is an improvement in the sense that at least he'll be known to a lot of people in the business community. He doesn't seem to be afraid to have conversations with people in the business community. I think the more important thing here is that he has a long time association with Mr. Carney, so presumably has Mr. Carney's trust on some of these issues. The problem is not that the Natural Resources Department has been standing in the way of natural resource development in this country, and frankly in Ontario and Quebec, as much as in Western Canada and in the Maritimes. The problem has been the environmental regulations that come out of the Environment Ministry. The Environment Ministry is huge now and much larger than it was 10 years ago, has many more levers over the Canadian economy, and the people in the Environment Department seem to be quite prepared to use all of them. The fact that we have basically, to be blunt, kind of a standard issue downtown Toronto social justice activist, kind of do-gooder NGO type person.
For readers or watchers, this is Julie D'Abruzin, the MP for Toronto Danforth.
Yeah, I mean the I don't know the woman, but the CV says. I grew up not far from there. I know the kind of the downtown Toronto salon intellectual gave up her private sector job to do charitable work for the community, which is admirable. And then this long history of kind of, we have to keep oil and gas in the ground and keep on Alberta and Saskatchewan from growing if we're going to save the planet. I mean, if that's the approach of the government, then we're in for a very difficult couple of years.
Yeah. Gene, I said in the column today that, the day after the swearing-in ceremony is when it all starts to go wrong. Pretty much you're at your peak of popularity, and it's downhill from there. Is that fair? I mean, Mark Carney has ridden on his reputation to this point to get elected, but really the rubber hits the road right now, yeah?
Absolutely, and I think the expectations are relatively high. His rhetoric has been fairly ambitious. Some of the things in the election platform are fairly ambitious. And now it's down to governing. And this is my point about you need competency in the cabinet. You have a competency deficit in the civil service, in my view, at the senior levels. And you need competency in the cabinet. You have some, I think, and we'll see whether some of these new ones will prove to be competent. But usually, as Ian would know, it takes a while for new ministers, to find their footing. I do want to say something about this whole Secretary of State business. There seems to be this sort of narrative, if you will, going around that secretaries of state are ministers, or secretaries of state are people that you can get focused on a specific issue within a portfolio and deliver results. That's nonsense in my experience. I once worked for a Secretary of State a long time ago. I think Ian probably will agree with me on this. One of the biggest challenges a Secretary of State has in the Canadian government is getting senior officials in their department to return their calls. There is a real competition here that goes on between secretaries of state and ministers and their offices. Secretaries of state have no legal authorities. They usually have no program authorities. And the idea, I can't think of, and maybe Ian can correct me if he's got an example here, of a Secretary of State in the long history of our Secretaries of State that has meaningfully advanced an important file in government. I've never seen it. So I'm very skeptical about this storyline that's coming out that these second-tier ministers can make a real difference in specific areas that they have attached to their titles. It's going to be up to the 28 front bench ministers, core ministers, to drive this government's agenda, to work with Mr. Carney. He says he's bringing back cabinet government. Of course, every prime minister says this, and none of the last three have. I think really the last time we had really functioning cabinet government in the old sense was probably under Chrétien 30 years ago, 25, 30 years ago. He says he wants to run a team. He says he wants to bring back cabinet government. He says he's going to empower ministers. Well, we'll see.
I mean, both of you know this instinctively, and Ian, you've written on this. The other person who wrote on it was Eddie Goldenberg in his book, The Way It Works, that under Chrétien they tried to create true cabinet government, but they've pretty much found that ministers are so absorbed with their own portfolios, they just don't have time or even inclination to contribute to the government agenda. I mean, it would seem to me that this is going to require a whole internal change within government, a streamlining, if you're going to get the efficiencies and the speed that Carney's talking about. I mean, he did in his first go-around get rid of various almost made-up departments, the Minister for Diversity, Inclusion and Persons with Disabilities, Tourism, Mental Health, Citizen Services. They're all gone already. So there does seem to be a streamlining. But it looks like we need a pretty major internal reform for him to fulfill what he said he's going to do. Ian?
Well, it's funny. Give me just a few minutes here to wonk out on this for a second. The timing of Mr. Carney's takeover of this government, I thought, was promising because he had this sort of period before the election where he had this kind of interim cabinet that was, poor Nate Erskine Smith and so forth, these sort of temporary ministers to show for the public for election purposes, and then toss them to the back benches because their usefulness was over. Very very short term ministry, and then of course he had. Janice Charette, the former clerk of the Privy Council and former Conservative political staffer, very close to him during the course of the election campaign. To me, what that spelled was serious changes to the structure of cabinet departments of the sort we haven't seen since Kim Campbell in 1993, when the Department of Canadian Heritage was stood up and so forth, when the structure of government in the sense that we think of it today was basically established 30 years ago. We're overdue, I think, for a reorg here. So for that reason, Evan Solomon's appointment as Minister of Digital something or other, I'm not sure I quite understood all of the terms in his title here. He's a minister, a high-profile person, of course, Mr. Carney's personal advisor on art acquisition or whatever it was. So close to Mr. Carney personally, we assume. He has this title without a department. Is there going to be a department created over the summer to kind of underfill that portfolio? That was the sort of thing that I was expecting to see yesterday, with a big plan for a new organization of, we wouldn't be the first OECD country with a Minister for Digital Affairs. It's probably overdue. Is that what we're going to get? I don't know. So we haven't really seen that much of reorganization here. We have some slight changes to Mr. Guilbeault's title and so forth. Is there going to be a big reorganization or realignment of the responsibilities of these departments in a way that I think is overdue? It's difficult to do, except at the beginning of a prime minister's time in office. After that, God, it's murderous to try to reorganize government responsibilities after that. I have scars, and and so I think that if we're going to wait again for another change of prime ministership, we're waiting for another couple of years.
What do you think, Gene?
Well, okay, so adding titles to the junior ministers that says one thing or another that doesn't necessarily correspond to existing department. This is, again, out of Mr. Trudeau's playbook. You'll recall we had the Secretary or Minister of State for Middle Class Prosperity 7 or 8 years ago that was squirreled away somewhere in the Department of Finance and had nothing to do for the entire time they were in office. I called these people fake ministers. I still call them fake ministers. On the point about the big reorganization, I take Ian's point. It's needed, but there's never a good time for it. Probably the only time, as Ian says, that you can do it is at the beginning of a mandate, but I don't think you can really do it at the beginning of a minority government mandate because it's going to take up a lot of legislative bandwidth to reorganize these ministries. They have talked about, they made an election platform commitment to create a new organization called a Defense Procurement Agency. That sounds innocuous. It's not. That's a massive complex machinery of government change involving 3 or 4 departments. And it'll be interesting to see if they even have the stomach to try and carry that out in a minority government context. Machinery of government changes, in my view, rarely yield the claimed benefits. They tend to be very painful things to execute. The new organizations tend to take years, if not decades, to gel. So one wonders whether it's almost, we're stuck with the basic structure we have, whether we like it or not, because the pain and the effort that's needed to make the kind of major changes I think Ian's pointing to, and I would agree we need, usually just aren't worth it.
The other thing that strikes me is that, you've got all these shiny new ministers, but you've got a political staff that is probably exhausted and needs to be replenished. And I mean, I'm not entirely sure at the moment what the state of the deputy minister cohort is like, but you need all 3 of those people to be firing at all cylinders if you're going to be a success. Are we in good shape on that front, do you think, Ian?
Recruiting political staff is always difficult. I think there'll be an intake of new political staff that come with Mr. Carney, whether they're political in the small p sense of understanding the political consequences of what they're doing, or whether they're enthusiasts for some pet project of Mr. Carney's or of Brookfield's or of Goldman Sachs or whoever. I don't think we know yet. We'll see over the next year, but there'll be some people who come from his corporate past who may or may not have the sense that it takes to be in government. The senior folks obviously have been around for quite a while, so that's helpful. I do want to talk about the bureaucratic side because the next step ordinarily would be a reorganization in the Privy Council office and the central agency closest to the Prime Minister that sort of keeps track, sends out the instructions to the rest of government and checks to make sure whether anybody's paid any attention to those instructions over the course of the next couple of months. And then the rest of the Deputy Minister group. In my view, not so much of the Deputy Minister group is weak. I mean, there's some very good people in there. It's just way too big. There's Deputy Ministers. I mean, Gene talked dismissively about fake ministers, which I agree with his assessment there. There's a bunch of fake deputy ministers floating around too. People with highfalutin titles, DM3, DM2, pay scales, all the accoutrements of the deputy minister group, all the status in Ottawa that comes with deputy minister. This is like being, viceroy of some Central European satrapy during the Holy Roman Empire. This is a big deal. When you go to the Reno Club, being a deputy minister is a big deal. Unless you're the deputy minister of something that doesn't really exist and your staff is 4 or 5 people and stuck away in some obscure office building, and Ottawa is full of them. Frankly, the Privy Council office itself is full of them. And if I were advising on transition or on machinery of government, which I don't do, I would say the next step is to just get rid of that. All those people really streamline down your senior civil service team in order to focus authority on a handful of people who can make things work for you. Mr. Carney knows all these people. They all know him. He's as well placed as any new prime minister is to make changes in this group. I expect there'll be big changes. Whether they'll be between now and the return of Parliament, I don't know. But if he doesn't make them between now and the end of Parliament, you're sort of wasting the summer opportunity for new deputies, new ministers, and a streamlined team to get things moving for the fall session of Parliament. If Mr. Carney and his senior team gets focused on dealings with Mr. Trump, that kind of more fundamental investment in the future of the Carney government could go by the wayside, and he cannot waste the summer. He cannot waste the summer with ministers not knowing exactly what they're supposed to do, deputy ministers worried about whether they're going to be shuffled in August or September. If you get into it, the worst thing you can do is start making changes in August just before the House of Commons comes back to the sitting in that senior civil service team, because then stuff isn't ready when the House comes back in September, and you lose the whole parliamentary year. So really, I would, if there's going to be big changes on the civil service side, they have to come between now and the throne speech in May, or maybe the first week of the sitting of Parliament, because otherwise you're blowing what could otherwise be a very productive and creative summer.
Gene, I mean, I take Ian's point that Mark Carney knows the bureaucracy inside out, but it's a very different beast than he's used to. I mean, his will was the command of those below him in central banks that were relatively small organisations. He has now got this great unwieldy machine where an order from him becomes a recommendation down the chain, and eventually when it reaches the operational level, it's a suggestion, and if it even reaches that level. Do you think, I mean, what can he do here to... The government essentially cannot live off his effervescence. Does he need to perhaps temper expectations, dial down the ambition?
Well, he needs to get back to, as we discussed a few minutes ago, a real cabinet government where he devolves authorities to his key ministers, and he focuses on a handful of things. I completely agree with Ian about the growth of the senior executive ranks of the federal civil service is a scandal. It's not just deputy ministers. Look at assistant deputy ministers. You could blow out 40% of the assistant deputy ministers in this town that I sit in talking to you today in Ottawa, and no Canadian would notice. The Privy Council office, the Prime Minister's department, has 1,400 officials working in it. Now, when Ian was in the Prime Minister's office, there were 700 people working there. When I was in government, before that, there were 400 people working there. You could cut that organization in half tomorrow and nobody would notice. So he needs to take a scalpel, again, the butcher analogy, not just to his cabinet, to the senior civil service. Cut it down, because it's so big now, in my opinion anyway, it's so big, it's inefficient, and it can't execute. All it can do is basically run process and hold meetings because it's gotten so big. It used to be, and Ian will remember this, you remember this, John, being an assistant deputy minister was a big deal in the federal government. It's not a big deal anymore. They're all over the place. You've got branches in departments with 3 assistant deputy ministers. You never had that before. You had 1 per branch. So there's a lot of branches that can be cut here. There needs to be root and branch reform of the executive ranks of the federal civil service. And that's going to have to start, I think, with a new clerk.
John Hannaford being the clerk at the moment, who was the clerk under Justin Trudeau too. You mentioned the fact that Carney didn't really get to the joints. He didn't cut enough bone away, but he did cut some. And every cabinet shuffle ends up, as Louis XIV once said, with dozens of malcontents and 1 ingrate with every appointment. Does that damage the morale and the cohesiveness of this Liberal team going forward, Ian?
No, I think, look, in the short term, you're going to get some people who are upset that they're not sitting at the cabinet table.
You mentioned Nate Erskine-Smith, who already on Twitter has been out saying he feels disrespected.
Yeah, I was sort of astounded by his public statement on Twitter. A much better example, I think, is Bill Blair, who is a credible Minister of Defense, got some important equipment purchases through the cabinet process. Might have been seen, I would think, under the current circumstances as too close to the Americans, perhaps, given what Mr. Carney said about a new relationship with the United States. But I regret seeing the end of Bill Blair at the cabinet table for the time being. I think Mr. Carney might do well to think again about bringing him back in some future cabinet shuffle, as some of his new ministers will undoubtedly prove to be not up to his trust. But that said, the proof of the Prime Minister's willingness to impose his priorities, and more importantly in this case, his schedule on the public service and on the cabinet, is his ability to fire people. Is his unwillingness to take faffing around, as I think the British say, the kind of the circular policy process which never goes anywhere. We're told through some, I think, strategic leaks that Mr. Carney's been very pointed with some of his briefings about how do we get this to move faster, how do we get this to move deeper, how do we get change through the system here. I've seen Mr. Carney in action around the table asking these sorts of questions. The question will be 3 months from now or 4 months from now, when he gets the impression that somebody is circular processing his directions, or as Eugene said, it gets down to the operation level, it's a mere suggestion. Who's he willing to say, I'm sorry, I've had enough of that. It's July. I've been on this since April. You haven't seen any progress. I don't see a viable plan here. You're out. We've had, I don't remember the last time we've had Prime Minister who was very harsh about that. I have to say Mr. Harper was not. And despite his reputation for being ruthless, in fact, he was quite amenable to, in particular, officials who put his directions into the circular process. We'll see whether Mr. Carney is willing to make the kinds of waves that says, sorry, I've lost patience with you. It's time to find somebody who can move this at the speed that is required.
Yeah. Okay, Gene, last word.
Well, I just on your point there, I mean, cabinet ministers come and go in every government. Shuffles happen, people move on. It all comes down, you can still maintain a cohesive team, though. It all comes down to how the Prime Minister deals with his or her caucus. That's the key thing. If he's respectful of caucus and he listens to his caucus members, he tries to utilize them in other ways outside the cabinet, formal cabinet structure. He's seen as accessible to his caucus and his ministers, which Mr. Trudeau clearly was not. And he is seen as part of a team, the leader of the team, but part of the team rather than apart from the team. Then I think he'll have no trouble managing unity and having a cohesive group behind him.
Yeah. Great chat, guys. Thank you very much for coming on. We'll see you again soon.
See you guys.
Take it easy.